Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's daily devotional. Our daily devotional today is going to come from two articles, actually. And it's regarding this saga involving this Canadian quote unquote pastor or preacher. Pastor, according to the New Testament, is an elder, one of at least two that must be in each individual congregation. A pastor is not an evangelist, but um, generally in the religious world, people kind of call preachers and evangelists pastors, and that's typically what they mean. And so, the title of this particular article, Canadian Pastor Arrested on Tarmac Over COVID Rules, says police confiscated luggage and snooped laptop. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these articles, mainly because, well, at least not this first one anyway. I want to get to the second one primarily. But there are several different aspects to this, and to be clear, there's no way to be completely sure exactly what the full story is. Uh, but you'll see what I mean here in just a minute. So this preacher, he when he landed in Calgary, they took his went through his luggage, they went through his laptop. Pawlowski had been traveling throughout the United States over the summer to spread his warning that Western governments increasingly resemble the communist regime in Poland he fled as a young man. His tour followed the international attention he received in April when officials went to his church in Canada during Holy Week to inspect it for COVID-19 compliance. Because they entered the sanctuary armed and uninvited during a worship service, Pawlowski refused to speak with them. Instead, he accused them of being Nazis and shouted them down until they agreed to leave. Video of the encounter went viral. 3 weeks later, officials returned with a court order authorizing them to access Pawlowski's church and arrest him if he failed to comply. Again, he demanded they leave the church property and contact his lawyer. Okay. There's been a lot of, especially over the COVID-19 stuff, there's been a lot of infringement throughout the world, and even to some degree in the United States, on what is typically considered religious liberty. And there is obviously, as an American, I don't necessarily agree with what these individuals are doing, talking about the government. At the same time, Pawlowski has kind of started garnering a reputation for antagonizing the government, the Canadian government. And I'm not sure that as a Christian that's what we're supposed to be doing, antagonizing the government. In fact, if anything, we should be supporting the government, even at times when maybe they aren't doing the things that we agree with politically. It's interesting that he refused to speak with them. Okay, yes, it's in a worship service. You would think that maybe the worship service could continue and he could go speak to them or something along that lines. But they came armed, they came uninvited. I'm not sure how we would handle something like that at the congregation of Wichita Falls if something like that were to happen. I would think we could pause worship for a little bit to address whatever concerns our government officials had, to be able to take care of that, and then continue on. I don't see a problem with that per se from a Christian perspective. From an American's perspective, a constitutional perspective, yeah, I'd have a problem with that. But he accused them of being Nazis and shouted them down. Again, antagonistic. I don't know that would have been the best way to handle it as a Christian, much less as a preacher. And then they come back with a court order, so it's lawful. They want to make sure that everything's going according to the COVID-19 protocols. They are threatening to arrest him if he doesn't follow the court order. Certainly, if it had been elevated to this point, I think as a Christian, I think you comply. Okay, I think you do what they're telling you to do. Let them do whatever kind of checking for COVID-19 protocol or whatnot that they want to. But he demanded that they leave the church property and contact his lawyer. So, he was charged criminally. The first criminal charge, Pulaski explained, was levied against him for failing to wear a mask in public despite a medical exemption from his doctor. It's his contention that they're targeting him specifically because he's a preacher. The second was for organizing an illegal church gathering. Both are related to offenses in March and June. I don't know what all the saga has been regarding church gatherings in Canada and what constituted an illegal church gathering. Was it because they weren't following protocol, or was it the fact that they were gathering at all? Again, that particular point, whether or not a church can gather and so forth, obviously that's some churches decided to not attend here in the United States while we were on lockdown, to go ahead and accommodate the request from local government for a short period of time, just kind of while we were still figuring out what COVID-19 was doing. But since then, obviously, I think most congregations, if not all, have gone back to at least one service on Sunday in some form or fashion. And many of them, even during the lockdown, were gathering in cars and so forth. Uh, Obviously, there would be a lot more details that I'd be curious about on that. But regardless, we go on. There's a whole lot more in this article, but there's a couple points that he makes that I want to bring out here. Since the pandemic, other churches in Canada and Alberta have faced imprisoned pastors, locked facilities, steep fines, and continued interference from government officials. Pulowski believes churches and clergy are being targeted because they have historically opposed tyranny. From a broad religious perspective or organized religion perspective, yes, that's true. In terms of whether or not Christ wants us to oppose tyranny, uh, there is no. We're not told we're supposed to necessarily be political activists. That's not to say we can't be, but we have to be very careful because our home's in heaven. That's our goal, and we're citizens in heaven, and as a result, we're to obey the laws here. And even if those laws are tyrannical, as long as those laws do not prevent us from worshiping God the way He's commanded or from serving God as He's commanded, we're to submit to those even tyrannical laws. But in his defense, or in defending himself, this is what Pulowski says. Jesus Christ is very clear, the pastor said. He says, who comes to me is free indeed. We preach freedom, we preach hope. When you don't have hope in society, then the people are turning for that hope to the government. I think the government wants to become God, to be worshipped. Anyone else or anything else that competes with that has to be destroyed. Okay. My interpretation of this statement. Come here. I don't know what that is. That looked like a spider, and he disappeared. Nope. Get off of me. Sorry. Never had that happen before. It was just a itty bitty spider, but it has 8 legs, man. Okay. My interpretation of this statement from Pulowski is, he who comes to me is free indeed. I take that to mean free as in physical freedom. I assume that's how he's utilizing this. We preach freedom. We preach hope. It could very well be that he's using it in the context of spiritual freedom, but and he's then associating the fact that the government wants to be God and government wants to be worshipped and so forth. Okay, I understand if that's how you think about the government. The problem is, even if the government wants to become God and the government wants to be worshipped, that doesn't mean we have to worship the government. And if the government wants to be worshipped, that's on the government. Okay, again, we are required to submit to the laws and ordinances that are given to us by those in authority, government or otherwise, our employers, whatever, unless it contradicts the gospel of God. That is unless it contradicts or causes us to sin, or if we were to submit to it or whatnot. That is what we're supposed to recognize. And he's using, I tend to look at this as being used out of context. I don't know that for sure. He doesn't specifically say one way or the other how he's applying this, but obviously, when we look at the text that he's quoting, which is John chapter 8, Jesus is in a context of sin. He says, "Most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. The slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed." Obviously, this is a spiritual, religious sin versus free from sin, that type of context, not physically free. Again, I can't be sure one way or the other how he's utilizing or applying that, but it's important to note that. The second thing that we need to bring out also is what Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 13. "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God." And then, of course, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. And then he goes on to describe service being submissive to your masters and so forth. And of course, that certainly is equated to employers and employees in our society. But the point that Peter makes here is that you're to submit yourself to every ordinance of man. Again, aside from Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5 to an extent, where Peter and John, do you think it's better for us to obey you rather than God? Okay, you be the judge of that. Should we obey you and disobey God, or should we obey God and disobey you? But that's the specific situation that Peter and John are addressing. It's a situation in which God has given us this commandment. In order to obey you, we have to break the commandment of God. And of course, that command from the Sanhedrin was to not teach in the name of Jesus Christ anymore. That is the only situation under which we find valid justification for not obeying any type of commandment of God, or any type of commandment of man. And it's important that we separate our thought processes from of being an American, being looking at things contrary to, or in comparison to, or in the context of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, or whatever the Canadian equivalent of that would be, and to make sure we look at things from the perspective of a Christian. And now, certainly, does that mean that can we make political decisions? Can we make choices to support certain freedoms as an American? Sure. But we have to be very careful with that. We have to make sure we choose those positions very carefully and choose those actions very carefully so as to not infringe upon what God calls us to do, which is to submit yourselves to every ordinance of man. It talks about kings, governors, and even masters or employers. And so it's a very tricky situation to be in. It's a very difficult situation for us to be in. Now, having said that, look at this next article. Canadian pastor defiant as judge orders him to parrot medical experts from pulpit. I will not obey. So this article was posted. This is the same guy we're talking about, Pulowski. This was October 2nd. Well, now we've got an update to the story. This was published 2 days ago. The Polish-Canadian pastor who has been jailed for holding church services in Calgary, Alberta, said he will refuse to obey a court order mandating him to publicly echo the established opinions of medical experts regarding COVID-19. The ruling is the latest development in Alberta's ongoing legal battle against Pulowski, who faced a civil contempt charge for holding church services in violation of a court order forbidding organizing, promoting, or attending an illegal public gathering. Now, how are they defining illegal public gathering? Again, I don't know all the details to that, if it was just a public gathering in general, or if it was a public gathering that wasn't adhering to COVID-19 protocols. Again, if a government is saying, "Hey, we're fine with y'all attending, just you have to observe COVID-19 protocols, whether it's social distancing, wearing a mask, whatever," as citizens here, that is not infringing on our ability to worship, and so we should be willing to yield to the command of the government. If they say, listen, that's fine, y'all want to attend, you want to worship, that's fine, but you have to wear a mask, you have to social distance, whatever. Okay, there shouldn't be anything wrong with submitting to that. Again, as an American, is it repulsive? Yes, but as a Christian, I can still obey that command from the government and still obey God. There's not a problem. So again, I'm not sure what illegal public gathering, how that's being defined. Um, in addition to tens of thousands of dollars in costs and fines, one condition of Pawlowski's probation requires him to parrot the majority of medical experts in Alberta regarding social distancing, mask wearing, and vaccines, even when he speaks in church. Um, Now, to be clear, I don't know what the content of Pawlowski's pulpit preaching contains. I don't know what all's involved in that, but he's very politically active, and there are multiple examples of evangelists or quote unquote pastors in the pulpit providing political commentary or even political activism from their position in the pulpit. I don't believe that is the place, first of all, to offer political commentary. The Bible doesn't offer political commentary. The Bible does not give us guidance as political activists. So therefore, as a preacher of God's word, it is not my place or the place of any preacher to use the pulpit to push certain political ideas or agendas, even if it's in support of physical freedom or in support of the American spirit or the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. That's not the place. I believe that is an abuse of the pulpit to try to use it for that purpose. It should be for the purpose of preaching the gospel. I am obviously, and we're going to talk about why this obviously this is an overstep, I believe, big time of the government to try to force him to make statements. But I am assuming it is in response to the fact that he's using the pulpit to preach commentary on or to teach political commentary on social distancing, mask wearing, and vaccines. I'm assuming that this is their attempt to get him to quit using the pulpit to try to talk about COVID-19 or to speak bad about the government or some other aspect to that. I don't agree with them going that far, but I also don't agree with Pawlowski using the pulpit for that purpose. The final term of his probation order will be that when he is exercising his right of free speech and speaking against the AHS, including electronic social media, he must indicate in his communications the following, wrote Germain, who appended his script. So there's a this is what he has to say. But notice when he's exercising his right of free speech and speaking against, that's very vague, but it gives you the impression that he only has to say these things if he's going to be using the pulpit as a political stage. This is what he has to say. I'm aware of the views I'm expressing to you in this occasion may not be views held by the majority of medical experts in Alberta. While I may disagree with them, I'm obliged to inform you the majority, yada, 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 yada. Okay, PSA. Public service announcement type of thing. Pawlowski told Fox News he has no intention of complying with Germain's sanction, which he condemned as unconstitutional, illegal, and a clear instance of compelled speech like in China and North Korea. Yes, I do agree that is beyond the pale. That's beyond anything that should be allowed. However, I believe that this is a direct response to Pawlowski's using the pulpit for political activism, and he shouldn't be doing that in the first place. So if he were only teaching the gospel, teaching about what the Bible says, and was teaching submission to government unless it causes to contradict God or to disobey God, I don't think it would be an issue. Now, I could be wrong. It could be an issue anyway, because I don't know how strict the Canadian laws are on this particular issue. But this is what Pawlowski says. This crooked judge wants to turn me into a CBC reporter or CNN reporter that every time that I'm in public, every time I'm opening my mouth, I am to pray their mantra to the government, he said. I can see why he thinks that. And if he were being compelled every time he got in the pulpit, regardless of what he was going to say, whether it was political commentary or teaching the gospel, I would definitely agree. But, and again, as an American, it shouldn't matter. As an American, freedom of speech should mean that you can use the pulpit for whatever you want. But as a Christian, that's not what it's to be used for in the first place. They describe this law, the judge's sanction, as bizarre. It's unconstitutional. This is totally and wholly new as far as sentencing goes. It's highly unusual and rare. Miller said it remains unclear how and to what extent Pawlowski's speech will be monitored for compliance, but noted there appears to be no caveat protecting what he says from the pulpit. Again, from what perspective? If there's nothing protecting his speech from the pulpit, are we talking about anything, gospel or otherwise? Obviously, that would be a problem. If it's only talking about political activism and COVID-19 and the government's bad, that sort of thing, okay, I understand. As an American, again, bad. As a Christian, it shouldn't matter. They're telling me what I can and cannot preach, Pawlowski said. They're telling me that every time I want to address the public, I have to spew their lie first in order for me to deliver my message. That's China, that's North Korea. What message? I'm not sure what message he's referring to. If it's the message that you shouldn't get a vaccine or that you shouldn't wear masks or you shouldn't social distance, that's not the message you're supposed to be spreading from the pulpit. Not to say that you shouldn't have that freedom. In America, you have the freedom to do that. But again, as a Christian, if your government tells you, do not use your pulpit for political activism, that shouldn't be a problem. We shouldn't be using it for that in the first place. But then, in addition to that, we are to submit to every ordinance of man. So, what's the problem here? Again, does it infringe upon what's established to be rights from the Constitution? Sure. But you know what? What Peter says in 1 Peter 2, verse 13, does not say, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, as long as it complies with the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. That's not what that says. Even if we have the right to protest, even if we have the right to say no and suffer fines or whatever because the government's told us to do something, just because the Constitution gives us the right to do it doesn't mean we should. It doesn't mean that we should exercise that right as Christians. Because what does it say? Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man, not just the ordinances that fall in line with what you believe the Constitution or Bill of Rights say you should do. It makes it a very important distinction. Now, also, I want to note that, and I'm going a little bit long, and I apologize, but the judge, he talks a little bit about Pawlowski's attitude as well. He issued an extensive and personal rebuke to Pawlowski in which he speculated the pastor wants to be punished. He wants, basically, the judge thinks he wants to be made into a martyr. Throwing him in jail would be a slap on the wrist. It will make him a martyr, he says. Germain said Pawlowski taunted me to imprison him with his statement before the court in September when he claimed to be a political prisoner of conscience and denounced Canadian politicians as liars, hypocrites, and cheaters. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Canadian politicians are liars, hypocrites, and cheaters. It doesn't matter if, as this guy Pawlowski is going to say, that this judge is crooked. It doesn't matter. Peter doesn't say to submit to every ordinance of man as long as it's just. That's not what it says. Pawlowski told Germain that if he intended to prison him as AHS was demanding, he should also imprison Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, yada, yada, yada. Germain singled out Pawlowski's denunciation of Kenney, claiming he viewed it as evidence of the pastor's fervent desire that I martyr him by giving him a little more jail time to add a little more gasoline to the anti-mask, anti-vaccination fire. Footage from the trip that Pawlowski took, the justice claimed, was evidence that Pastor Pawlowski oozes hubris while relishing in his notoriety. I don't know if that's true or not. It could be. It could be that Pulaski's using this as an opportunity to look how righteous I am, look how just I am, and I'm being persecuted, and trying to get a spotlight on that. It could be, or it may not be. It could be that the judge just has it out for Pulaski. Pulaski says, "I'm not hiding. I'm not a criminal. I said I will not obey this court order. Why not? As a Canadian or as an American, would I be against it? Yes. I would be against that court order. I would think that was an unjust court order. As a Christian, which Pulaski claims to be, you shouldn't have a problem with the court order as long as it doesn't infringe upon what God has told you to do, which is to teach the gospel from the pulpit, which is what you're supposed to be doing anyway. I refuse to obey a crooked judge's order. Why? Who cares if he's a crooked judge? As long as it doesn't infringe upon what I am to do before God. He's not a judge, he's a political activist. It doesn't matter. He's a political activist. That is not justification to not follow a court order. And if it sounds like I'm getting excited here, it's because I am. It's frustrating when you see individuals attempting to use religion as a means of furthering political activism. Because that brings a bad name on religion. It brings a bad name on God and Christ and on the church. As if the church is some kind of a sanctuary for certain politically minded people. That's not what the church is supposed to be. It's supposed to be the pillar and the ground of the truth, as Paul tells Timothy. So, obviously, I'm sure there's a lot more to these stories than what we have available to us. But based on what's here, you almost have to cut yourself down the middle. You have to look at these things as an American and say, that's terrible. What would we do in that situation? But then as a Christian, you say, well, we wouldn't be in that situation because we wouldn't be using the pulpit to speak bad about the government and telling everybody not to wear masks or not to social distance or not to get vaccines and so forth, because that's not the purpose of the church. It's not the purpose of the pulpit. And we would or should be teaching our brethren to submit to the ordinances of man, unless it causes us to violate the commandments of God. And it really is putting a very interesting dichotomy in the spotlight here among Christians, especially in America, but for that matter, everywhere. This might be one of the first few times, at least in my memory. I don't know if maybe there have been other times in the past where some similar situations have taken place, where it's forced Christians to really reflect on what their duty is as a Christian to the government versus their duty as an American, to uphold the values that we believe as Americans we should have: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, yada, 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 no government overreach. But which comes first? Well, our service to God comes first. God says you're to obey the commandments of man, whether you like it or not, whether it applies to the Constitution or Bill of Rights or not. You follow the laws. You follow the rules. Unless by following those rules that causes you to disobey God. And it's putting a lot of Christians in a difficult position, having to make that distinction, having to make those choices, and some may be having to make those choices. We've talked before about the preferred pronouns and how that it's becoming an issue for teachers in many school districts, where they're being told you have to honor the preferred pronouns of kids. And we've talked before, I believe that that's wrong. It would be sinful. It would be wrong to call a boy a girl just because he wants to be called a girl. And that's would be lying. It would be lying. And so what decision are we going to make? Are we going to choose to submit to that and do something wrong? Do something sinful? Or are we going to stand up as Christians and say, no, that's not right, and if you got to fire me, you got to fire me? Anyway, just some things to think about. I thought this was kind of interesting and particularly applicable, even though it's Canada. It's not difficult to think about this happening here in America too, and we just have to recognize that these are the types of things that some preachers, some churches are facing, not just in Canada, but worldwide, and to recognize, first of all, well, what may have contributed to that, maybe political activism on the church's part, on the preacher's part, which shouldn't be happening anyway. But if they can do it to, if they can do this stuff to preachers and churches that are political activists, they can do it to ones who aren't. And once you open that door, that distinction becomes very blurred. What difference does it make? All right. That's the daily devotional for you today. It's been 30 minutes. I've gone 15 minutes overtime. I apologize. But I think this is an important point to consider and important stuff to think about with relation to the dichotomy of being a citizen of heaven versus being a citizen on earth. All right. So our next daily devotional, Lord willing, will be tomorrow at 6:30. Lord willing, I hope to see you all then. Thanks, everybody.